The Ministry of Magic kept its welfare files in the lower floors, in a section of the archive so rarely visited that the corridor smelled of old parchment and something faintly mineral, like stones in the first hours after rain. Amelia Bones had requisitioned the files herself 3 weeks ago in the way she did everything, with a memo, a clear statement of purpose, and a date by which she required a response. The date had passed. The files had arrived, wheeled in on a squeaking trolley by a junior clerk who had not made eye contact with her once, which meant she was being avoided, which, in her experience, meant the files contained something that someone had decided was not her business. That was precisely why she had asked for them. The woman at the desk was broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with very short grey hair and brows thick enough to suggest a permanent skepticism, even when her face was otherwise at rest. She wore a monocle because she needed one for close reading, and because she had never seen the point in pretending otherwise. The office was hers, had been hers for going on 2 years, and she had furnished it to work in rather than to impress. 1 desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of reference volumes with the spines well cracked. The window behind her looked into another ministry corridor, not the sky, and gave nothing in the way of natural light. She did not mind. Light was not what she was here for. The Welfare Review was Fudge's initiative, or had been framed as such when he announced it in the autumn briefing. A decade after Voldemort's fall, the ministry would audit all post-war custodial arrangements for magical children still registered as minors. It was the kind of initiative that sounded considered when read aloud in a meeting room. Amelia had not said, at the time, what she thought of the 10-year gap between the end of the war and the first formal check on whether the children from it had ended up somewhere appropriate. She had said only, "Very good, she would see to it." She was seeing to it on a grey morning in October 1990, in an office that smelled of lamp oil and ink. She adjusted her monocle and turned to the next file. The name at the top was Harry James Potter. She paused, not because she was surprised by the name, because everyone in the wizarding world knew the name, had spoken it for nearly a decade in the particular hushed register reserved for things still too heavy to say at full volume, but because the file was thin. Professionally, wrongly thin. She opened it and read it at the same deliberate pace she gave to everything. She was looking, as a matter of professional habit, for a guardianship order, a welfare assessment, a formal registration of placement, the standard post-war documentation she had reviewed for every other file in this stack. She found none of those things. There was a record of his birth, 31st of July, 1980. There was a record of his parents, James Fleamont Potter and Lily Potter, née Evans, both deceased as of the 31st of October, 1981. There was a record of the attack at Godric's Hollow, a note that the boy had survived, sole survivor, the precise manner of his survival, marked elsewhere as confidential. There was, in short, a record that he existed. There was no record of where he had gone, no welfare assessment, no formal documentation of any custodial arrangement, no Wizengamot guardianship order, no registered magical guardian, no record of the decision that had placed him somewhere on the 2nd of November in 1981. No record of who had made that decision. No record of anyone having been asked. The ministry's file for the most famous child alive contained his birth, his parents' deaths, and then a silence as complete as a locked door. She pulled the Dursley family file, obtained via cross-referencing Muggle civil records, 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Also thin. No ministry communication, no welfare check, no indication that any official of any department had so much as written a letter to the address. What every witch and wizard knew, if you pressed them, was that Harry Potter was with Muggle relatives. Dumbledore had arranged it. He was safe. He would come to Hogwarts in due course. These were comfortable facts, the kind that allowed a person to stop needing to look further. Amelia had never found comfortable facts especially reliable. In her experience, comfortable facts were what people said when they did not want to look more closely at something they suspected they would not like. The comfortable fact about Harry Potter had been repeated for 9 years, without apparently prompting anyone to produce a single piece of paper confirming it. Common knowledge was not a legal record. A welfare assessment was a welfare assessment. They were not the same thing, and she had no patience for being told they were. She had a brother named Edgar. He had been a good man, careful with his work, careful with his family, a person who believed that doing the right thing constituted a kind of protection in itself. His wife had believed it too. His children had been too young for believing one way or another. The Death Eaters had come for them during the war, and they had not left anyone standing. Her parents had followed the winter after. Amelia had survived by the specific combination of being elsewhere and being very difficult to kill, and she had spent the decade since then building, with considerable deliberate effort, a department that operated on the principle that informal safety was not safety. She understood, at the level of tissue and bone, what happened when systems failed because no one had thought to fill in the paperwork. She understood it from the particular quality of grief that came not from malice, but from assumption, from the shared, comfortable conviction that someone else had it in hand, that a thing this important could not possibly have slipped through unattended, the conviction that allowed it to slip through. The file said no one had checked. It said, in its careful and absolute blankness, that the most consequential custodial decision made in the post-war wizarding world had been made by a single person, without ministry oversight, without documentation, without so much as a formal notification to the department whose business it expressly was. A child placed with Muggle relatives without a record. A placement that had persisted for 9 years without one welfare visit, one official inquiry, one letter. That was not a clerical oversight. A clerical oversight was a misdated form, a record stored in the wrong drawer. What she was looking at was the deliberate absence of process, the assumption that trust was an adequate substitute for law. She had seen this particular silence before, in other files, in other cases. She knew what it cost. Amelia closed the file. She sat for a moment with both hands flat on the desk. Through the window, a paper aeroplane drifted past in the corridor outside, carrying someone else's business to someone else's office. Then she drew a fresh sheet of parchment toward her, dipped her quill, and wrote in the careful, level hand she had practiced until it cost her nothing. Harry James Potter, welfare status and legal custodial record, inquiry to be opened. She set herself a deadline. She wrote that too. She signed it, blotted it, and filed it. The drawer closed with a quiet click. This was how these things began. 2 months produced 3 verifiable facts, and 1 large absence. The verifiable facts: Albus Dumbledore had made the placement decision unilaterally on the night of the 1st of November, 1981. Rubeus Hagrid, Hogwarts gamekeeper, had transported the child from Godric's Hollow to Privet Drive on Dumbledore's instructions. Minerva McGonagall, deputy headmistress of Hogwarts, had been present at the placement and had formally objected to it. The large absence, any ministry involvement whatsoever. The paper trail, such as it was, ran out immediately after the night of the 2nd of November and did not resume. She had written to 3 former members of the Wizengamot who had sat in 1981 and might have been consulted on guardianship matters. Two had not replied. One had replied with a careful note that he had no recollection of the Potter case coming before the Wizengamot in any capacity. She had requested Dumbledore's correspondence records for November 1981 through the Hogwarts Administrative Office and been informed, with apology, that no correspondence logs from that specific period were presently available for review. She had noted this, filed the note, and proceeded. She wrote to the deputy headmistress and requested a formal interview at her earliest professional convenience. The reply came in 2 days. That promptness told Amelia something. McGonagall had been expecting the letter, perhaps for years. Hogwarts in January was grey stone and cold corridors, and the particular hush of a school between its lessons. Amelia arrived by flu, was met by a prefect with an anxious expression, and was shown to the Transfiguration classroom on the 3rd floor. The room smelled of chalk and scorched wood, and the faint, sweet burn of whatever spell had been demonstrated last. The student desks had been moved to the walls. 2 chairs faced each other in the cleared centre of the room, which meant McGonagall had arranged this deliberately. Not an interview across a teacher's desk, but 2 professionals here about a shared matter. McGonagall herself was standing at the window when Amelia was shown in, which meant she had been standing there for some time. She was 55 years old, and looked it in the way that belongs to people who have earned every year. Dark hair shot through with silver, pinned into a bun so tight it looked architectural. Square spectacles, thin lips pressed into a line that was not severity, but habitual self-containment. A tartan dressing gown worn over her teaching robes, the working clothes of a woman who had come from her last lesson to this meeting without thinking it worth the interruption to change, or who had decided against it. She held herself with an erect bearing that gave no indication she had ever, in her life, simply stood. She turned when Amelia entered. Her expression was composed, guarded, and carried in it the wary recognition of someone who has known for a long time that a particular conversation was coming. Amelia set her case on one of the moved desks and took out parchment and quill. She thanked McGonagall for her time. McGonagall said of course, and settled into the chair across from her, hands folded, and waited. "If you would take me through the 1st of November 1981, Amelia said, "as you remember it." McGonagall gave her account. She had arrived at Privet Drive the morning of the 1st, and spent the day in her animagus form, observing the street and the household. She had spent the better part of 8 hours watching the Dursleys. By the time Dumbledore arrived that evening, she had formed a clear opinion of them, and she had stated it plainly. They were the worst sort of muggles imaginable. Those were her exact words. She had seen the boy's cousin kicking at his mother in the street, screaming for sweets, and she had told Dumbledore that the idea of placing a child like Harry Potter in that house was not something she could accept. She said all of this in a flat, careful voice, not rehearsed in the sense of dishonesty, in the sense of a person who had repeated this account to themselves many times, in private, in the specific hours when the mind will not stay quiet until the telling had become organized, the sequence worn smooth, the words arriving in the same order each time, because that was the shape they had settled into. "And Dumbledore's response?" Amelia said. "He told me it was the best place for him." McGonagall paused for a beat, not hesitation, but the pause of someone choosing precision. He explained the magical situation. Lily Potter's sacrifice, the protection that had deflected the killing curse, was anchored to blood. Petunia Dursley was Lily's sister. If Petunia accepted Harry under her roof and raised him as family, the protection would persist. A ward tied to blood and to the house, and to Petunia's consent, lasting as long as Harry could call it home. She stopped. He was not wrong about the magic. only about the suitability of the arrangement. I believed so. Yes. Amelia wrote it down. She wrote everything in her level, unremarkable hand, recording rather than summarizing. The description McGonagall had given Dumbledore of the Dursleys, the specific phrasing she had used, the magical rationale Dumbledore had offered, the absence of any alternative arrangement having been considered or any ministry process having been initiated. She did not editorialize. The facts, stated plainly, required nothing added. She looked up from the parchment. And after November 1981, Professor, did you make any further inquiry into the boy's welfare? McGonagall was still. It was not a long silence. Perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps 5. Long enough that the fire in the classroom grate gave a small shift and settled, and the grey winter light through the windows managed to seem, briefly, greyer. Amelia did not fill the silence. She had learned a long time ago not to fill silences of this particular quality, the kind that contained, in their specific, held-breath texture, the full shape of the answer before it arrived. What the silence contained, if you knew how to read it, was 10 years. Tender September 1sts, on which a name had appeared on the Hogwarts intake list, and someone had looked at it and done nothing. 10 years of a professional obligation that had been discharged once, discharged correctly, discharged with clarity and directness, and then, when it had been overruled, simply set down and not picked up again. When McGonagall spoke, it was one word in the same careful, flat voice she had used throughout. No. The fire gave another small sound. Outside, the grounds lay grey and still. Amelia wrote that down, too. She had been in the room 40 minutes. She thanked McGonagall for her time, packed her case, and walked back down the cold corridor to the flue. She thought, as she went, that McGonagall was the sort of person whose reckoning always ran inward, that it would therefore be comprehensive. The report took her 3 evenings. She wrote it in sequence, without commentary beyond what the evidence required. No formal custodial record in ministry files, no welfare assessment by any ministry department. The placement at 4 Privet Drive having been made by Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts, unilaterally, on the basis of a magical protection rationale not submitted to any legal body for review or approval. Minerva McGonagall, deputy headmistress and eyewitness, having objected at the time on grounds of household suitability, and having made no further inquiry into the child's welfare in the subsequent 9 years. She read it back twice. She changed one word. She labelled the folder in her usual plain way, Potter, H.J., Custodial Inquiry, and filed it. It would reach the minister's desk in the spring. The Minister for Magic had a habit of arriving late to meetings he had himself requested, which was a way of indicating that his time mattered more. Amelia Bones had found, over a long career, that people who arranged power this way generally had more of it than they deserved, and less than they imagined, and that the 2 conditions were related. She stood in the anteroom for 11 minutes before Fudge's assistant showed her in. Cornelius Fudge was a small, round man who kept his lime-green bowler hat on even at his desk, which Amelia had always found notable. Most people put their hat on a stand when they sat down. Fudge kept his. It sat on his head at the angle of a man who had decided that the hat was an extension of his authority, and saw no reason to remove extensions of his authority merely because he was indoors and seated. His robes were expensive. His desk was very large. He had, when she entered, the expression of a man who had been reading something with considerable care and had not yet determined how he wished to respond. The report was on the desk. She recognized the folder. She sat down. She waited. He read for another moment. Then he closed the folder with the deliberate slowness of someone who wants his response, once given, to seem considered rather than immediate. He placed his hands on the desk, looked at her with the warm and slightly furrowed attentiveness of a man listening carefully to a problem he fully intended to do nothing about, and said, "Amelia, thorough work. Very thorough indeed." She said nothing. "It is a great deal of paper," he said, "for a situation that has, one might argue, already resolved itself rather well. The situation," she said, "is an undocumented placement for a minor child." "Well," he said, and let the word do the work he didn't want to do himself. The boy was alive. That was the essential fact, and Fudge, turning it in his mind the way you turn a coin, could find no side of it that was a problem. The boy was alive and in good health, and would be starting at Hogwarts in September, and the war had been over for a decade, and the wizarding world had rebuilt itself on the precise and delicate consensus that Albus Dumbledore had done what was necessary in terrible times. That consensus was Fudge's ministry. It was the post-war peace. It was the reason people slept at night. To open a formal inquiry on the back of this report, to stand up in front of the wizarding world and suggest that Dumbledore, of all people, had placed a child without proper oversight, that the arrangement had gone unexamined for 10 years, that no one had checked, would be to take a lit match to the whole careful structure. For what? The boy was alive. The boy was going to Hogwarts. The blood protection had worked. The outcome was correct. The paperwork was imperfect. One of these things was a problem, and one of these things was not. Fudge knew which was which. He had built his first year in office on the patient reconstruction of a wizarding world that had spent a decade in terror, and he had done it by being the calm, sensible face of stability. Not the hero, not the genius, but the administrator, the reliable presence who kept things running while people recovered. There was something Fudge genuinely believed about himself, that he was good at his job, that his job was maintaining the peace, that anything threatening the peace was therefore something that needed to be carefully managed. This report was something that needed to be carefully managed. He explained to Amelia, with the measured warmth of a man who genuinely did not think of himself as doing anything wrong, that the question of Harry Potter's placement was a matter of considerable sensitivity. He explained the blood protection rationale, the exact magical logic she had herself documented on page 4 of the report he had been reading, as though she had not written it herself, as though the information were new, and she were receiving it as such. He told her that her concerns had been duly noted and were valued, and that the matter had been reviewed at the appropriate level, and that it was to be classified going forward as a matter of headmaster's discretion, which was an administrative category that removed it from the DMLE's operational record and placed it with the Hogwarts institutional file, where it would be appropriately handled. He said none of this with the slightest implication of threat or displeasure. He was, throughout, genuinely pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a man who had done this before, who had smoothed over a great many inconvenient things with warmth and patience, and the light assertion that the matter had been dealt with, and who had never had occasion to change his methods. Amelia thanked him for his time. She walked back to her office. The corridor was a long one, and she did not hurry. She was thinking, as she walked, about the particular quality of Fudge's explanation, the way he had described the blood protection rationale with the patient emphasis of someone offering her new information when the information was hers. It was a specific kind of contempt, even if he did not experience it that way. The assumption that she had not read her own document. The assumption that a good enough explanation would substitute for a good enough answer. She had been in government long enough to recognize the technique and not be surprised by it. She had known, when she filed the report, that this was the most probable outcome, She hadn't known it with despair, but with the level professional recognition of a person who has accurately assessed the available facts. Fudge would bury it. He would use the administrative machinery he had been building since he took office to reclassify it, smooth it over, and rely on the assumption that she had no institutional recourse. He was not wrong, technically, about his authority. He had the formal power to do exactly what he had done. She sat at her desk. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, not in defeat, but in the quiet way of someone completing a thought. She had made certain decisions over the weeks of writing the report about what she would do when it was buried. One of those decisions involved a blank sheet of parchment and a mechanism she had used before in matters concerning Gringotts Wizarding Bank. She drew the parchment toward her. She wrote in her careful level script, "For the record of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, sealed copy, Vault Notification Protocol, Ari Potter Trust Vault, Custodial Registration Gap, for institutional archiving." She signed it with her name and title. She sealed it with her personal DMLE departmental head's crest, not the ministry seal, which would carry the weight of institutional authority she had not been authorized to invoke, and which Fudge had now effectively revoked, but her own seal, which was hers to apply at her professional discretion, and which she was applying at her professional discretion now. She enclosed with it a clean copy of the report, sealed together, one document. She addressed it through the inter-institutional banking correspondence channel. This was a formal mechanism available to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for communications with financial institutions operating in Wizarding Britain. She had used it before in other matters. She had every right to use it in this one. Amelia Bones had not, in 20 years of DMLE work, once done something she did not have the right to do. She did not intend to start today. She handed it to the correspondence clerk. The envelope arrived at Gringotts the following morning. A Goblin clerk in the administrative archive received it, noted the departmental seal, and logged it in the incoming register. Potter Trust Vault, Custodial Notification, DMLE Head, Bones, received, Spring 1991. The clerk assigned it an archive reference number, stamped the entry, and filed it in the Vault correspondence section. The envelope was not opened. It did not need to be opened yet. That was the nature of an institutional archive. Things were kept, not read. They were kept precisely against the day when someone needed to read them. The clerk moved on to the next item. He turned 11 in a cupboard, which was not unusual. He had turned 10 in a cupboard, and 9 in a cupboard, and every birthday before that in a cupboard. And there was a continuity to it he had long since stopped examining. The cot was narrower than it used to be, because he had grown again. He lay in the dark on the morning of the 31st of July, with his knees almost at his chest, listening to the Dursleys moving about the kitchen above him, and he was 11 years old and did not particularly know what to make of it. He had untidy jet-black hair and bright green eyes, and a lightning bolt scar on his forehead that he had been told, when he asked, was the result of a car accident that had also killed his parents. He wore his cousin's cast-off clothes, 4 sizes too large. He was small for his age, in the way of a person who has spent 11 years being told, by various means, not to take up too much space. He did not know about the report that had been filed at the Ministry of Magic 6 months ago. He did not know about the woman who had written it, or the man who had buried it, or the sealed envelope sitting in a Gringotts archive 4 months after that. None of that was anything he had been given any reason to know, and Harry Potter had learned, early and thoroughly, not to expect that the information in the world which concerned him most was the information he would be offered. He got up. He made breakfast. It was his birthday. The day passed in the ordinary way of days at the Dursleys, the ambient contempt, the aggressive indifference, the elaborate non-acknowledgement of his existence, until the evening, when someone knocked on the front door hard enough to shake the frame, and then walked in without waiting for an answer. The man who came through the door was nearly as tall as the doorway, and considerably wider, and he had to turn sideways and duck his head to get through. And even so, the enormous pink umbrella he was carrying scraped the ceiling coming in. He had a shaggy black beard that covered most of his face, and beetle-black eyes, and the general appearance of a small building that had recently decided to go for a walk. He was carrying, along with the umbrella and a coat that could have served as a modest tent, a slightly squashed birthday cake, and a letter with Harry's name on the front in handwriting Harry had never seen. He set these on the kitchen table without ceremony and looked at Harry, and his face did something that Harry, in 11 years in this house, had never seen a face directed at him do. It became large and unconditionally glad. "Happy birthday, Harry," Hagrid said. His voice was like boulders shifting against each other at some depth. "Been hoping to catch you on the day." Harry stared at him. He had no experience of this. He did not know what to do with a face that was simply, entirely pleased to see him. He read the letter. His hands were not quite steady, not because he was frightened, but because something was trying to happen in his chest and he wasn't sure what it was. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, it said. And it said his name, and it said he was a wizard, and it said there was a place for him, a place that had been waiting for him, a place that knew he existed. Hagrid watched him read it. He watched the boy's face, which was trying not to be hopeful and not quite managing it. And he thought about things he always thought about when he saw Harry and never said. He thought about the night 10 years ago when Dumbledore had given him the task and he had driven through the dark on Sirius's old motorbike, the small, sleeping child bundled against his chest. He had collected the boy from the ruins of that house in Godric's Hollow and driven him through the whole long night to Privet Drive and handed him to Dumbledore, and he had wept the whole way. He was not a man who was ashamed of weeping. He had wept because the boy's parents were dead, and the boy did not know it yet. And the world the boy was going into was the world that had killed them. And none of that had seemed to Hagrid like a thing you shouldn't weep at. He didn't say any of this. He didn't know how to begin it. And Harry was already asking questions about Hogwarts, and Hagrid offered him a rock cake and decided that there was time, later, for the other things. There was always time later. Diagon Alley the next morning was the kind of overwhelming that worked on Harry like sunlight on a person who has spent a long time underground. The noise of it, the colours of it, the specific impossible ordinariness of a street where the shops sold broomsticks and potion ingredients and owl treats, the way no one in it found any of this remarkable. Harry moved through it slightly stunned, trying to look at everything at once, and mostly succeeding only in turning his head too fast. Gringotts was different. Where Diagon Alley was busy and warm, the bank was cool and formal and vast, with marble floors that threw back the sound of their footsteps, and a ceiling that vaulted high over a long counter where goblin tellers worked with the focused efficiency of people who find interruptions tedious. The feeling it gave Harry was not quite awe and not quite unease, but something in between. The feeling of an institution that knew exactly what it was and would not be asking your opinion about it. Griphook led them in silence to the cart. He was a goblin of moderate stature, with sharp eyes that moved with the professional quickness of someone whose job required him to notice things and give no indication of noticing them. The cart descended. The tunnels were dark and fast and cold, and Harry gripped the side and did not look down. The vault at the bottom was his. The door opened, and Harry Potter looked at his inheritance. It was heaped in piles that caught the torchlight, galleons gold on gold, sickles silver, nuts bronze in the corners, more money than he had ever held or seen or thought about, more money than had ever felt like it had anything to do with him. He stood in the entrance and breathed the warm mineral air and understood, at some level below words, that the people who had owned this were dead and had left it to him, and were the same people who had left him, in other ways, with the scar and the eyes and the name that everyone in the wizarding world apparently already knew. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. 3 paces behind him, Griphook's gaze moved to the vault's correspondence register, a thin brass panel inset into the stone beside the door, displaying in small, precise notation the administrative status of the account. The display showed what it had shown since spring: flagged item, correspondence file, pending review. He looked at it for 1 second with an expression that gave no information about his thoughts, which was the appropriate expression for a professional who had noted something and would act on it through correct institutional channels once he had returned to his counter. He noted it. Harry filled his bag with gold, counting out galleons with the bewildered carefulness of someone for whom the denominations are still theoretical. Hagrid helped, patiently, and they left the vault, and the door rolled shut behind them, and the cart carried them back up through the dark. Before the end of the working day, the flagged correspondence item in the Potter Vault administrative file had been forwarded to the Senior Gringotts Oversight Committee with a brief internal note. Primary account holder accessed vault for first time, 31st of July, 1991. Flagged archive item from spring. DMLE correspondence, custodial matter, recommended for committee review. The committee would convene within the week. Griphook went back to his counter. The Hogwarts Express left King's Cross at 11 o'clock precisely, and Harry Potter pressed his face to the window and watched London give way to the suburbs, and then to something wider and greener, and felt, for the first time he could remember, the particular lightness of moving toward something rather than away from it. He met Ron Weasley in a compartment 2 cars back, found him by the open door and the freckles and the easy slouch of someone who had never been shy a day in his life. Ron's robes had been let out at the hem, recently, by the uneven stitching, and his textbooks were second-hand and marked in another hand, and none of this appeared to trouble him in the slightest. He had siblings and a rat named Scabbers, and an easy manner with strangers that Harry filed away and marvelled at quietly. He ate the entire front half of Harry's chocolate frog without embarrassment, and explained Hogwarts houses and Quidditch and the sorting with the practiced authority of someone who has older brothers and has therefore been briefed. Hermione Granger came to their compartment looking for a boy's toad, found them, and stayed. She had bushy brown hair and large front teeth, and the contained energy of someone who had already read all the relevant textbooks and was holding back from saying so. Neville Longbottom arrived behind her, round-faced, braced, looking as though he expected whatever came next to require surviving. His toad was eventually located under a seat 3 compartments over, which none of them would have predicted. Percy Weasley appeared briefly in the corridor to say something to Ron, and departed with the manner of a person who had come to be useful rather than to visit. Fred and George Weasley passed the door at speed, laughing at something invisible. Harry watched all of them, the ease of people who had grown up moving through the world as though they had a right to it, and stored what he saw in the place where he kept things he did not yet know what to do with. Hogwarts arrived like an answer, given in a language he had not known he was missing. First the lake, the castle rising above it in the dark, the towers lit from within and reflected below. And something in Harry's chest recognized it in a way that had nothing to do with having been here before. He had never been here before. He did not know why it felt like that. The entrance hall was vast and warm and alive with sound. Professor McGonagall met them at the door. The severe bun, the tartan details, the spectacles, and the erect bearing that communicated, without effort, that she expected correct behavior and had no particular patience for the alternative. She was 55 years old and had been teaching at this school for decades, and she moved through the chaotic mass of anxious first years with the unhurried authority of someone who has seen this scene many times and found it, despite everything, still not without interest. The great hall opened before them. The ceiling was not a ceiling. It was a sky, dark and clouded, with the light of 100 floating candles caught in it, and the 4 long house tables spread below under that impossible height, and at the far end, on the raised dais, the staff table, and at the centre of it, the headmaster. Harry looked at Dumbledore. He had been told, in the weeks since meeting Hagrid, approximately who Albus Dumbledore was. The man at the centre of the staff table had very long silver hair, and a very long silver beard, and half-moon spectacles, and a crooked nose, and the kind of eyes, bright blue, particular, that seemed to be doing something more than simply looking at the room. He was 110 years old, and did not appear any specific age that made sense. He was watching the first year's violin with an expression that was warm and wholly unhurried, and when his gaze passed over Harry, Harry had the brief and disorienting sensation of being seen rather than observed. The sorting was conducted with a battered hat on a stool. Harry was called early. He sat on the stool, and the hat slid over his eyes, and murmured things to him in the dark, in the specific private way of something that has access to the interior of your skull, and has found something there it finds interesting. Then it shouted, "Gryffindor," and the table on the left roared, and Harry sat down among people who already knew who he was, and none of them could tell, just by looking at him, that 11 years had passed between the last time he had felt welcome somewhere, and right now Ron sat down next to him. Hermione was Gryffindor. Neville was Gryffindor. The hat took a long time with Neville before it said so. On the other side of the hall, a girl named Susan Bones was sorted into Hufflepuff and sat down among the cheering yellow and black table with the relief of someone whose worst outcome has been avoided. Harry did not know her name. He did not know that her surname was the same as the woman who had written the report that had been sitting in a Gringotts archive for 6 months, and he would not know that for a long time. At the staff table, Professor McGonagall watched the new Gryffindors take their seats. She had given her statement to Amelia Bones 9 months ago. She had not spoken to Dumbledore about it. She looked at Harry Potter. Untidy, jet-black hair, Lily's eyes, robes slightly too large at the shoulder in the way of borrowed things, and she watched the way he sat. He sat with his elbows in. He did not lean back or spread across the bench. He ate the first food that was set before him with the focused attention of someone who has learned not to assume there will be more. She had taught more than 3 decades of first years, and she knew, in the specific way of someone who has been paying attention across a long professional life, what a well-tended child looked like. She said nothing. She looked away. On the dais, Dumbledore rose to speak, and his voice carried warmly over the hall, and the enchanted ceiling showed a break in the clouds, and Harry Potter sat at the Gryffindor table between his new housemates and ate his dinner, and knew nothing about any of this. That same evening, in the vaulted lower chambers of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, the Senior Oversight Committee had been in session for an hour and a quarter. The room was stone and lamplight, the table long and low in the goblin fashion, the chairs supplemented with the neutral efficiency of an institution that received human visitors when it had to, and accommodated them without ceremony. 5 committee members were present. The flagged archive item from the Potter Vault access of 30 August's July had been reviewed in full. The sealed report from Amelia Bones, received spring 1991, had been read, cross-referenced, and verified against the Vault's own custodial records. The Vault records were unambiguous. The Potter Trust Vault had been undisturbed from November 1981 to the first access on 31st July 1991. No withdrawals, no registered custodian on file, no custodial management instruction documented in the Gringotts internal record. The vault had simply sat, sealed, accruing value, with no formally appointed guardian anywhere in its administrative history. Gringotts' contract protocol on vaults held for minor account holders was not complicated. A registered custodian was required. There was none. This was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of their own institutional record, which was not subject to revision by outside bodies, and had never been. The committee chairperson set down the last sheet of documentation and looked around the table. The others indicated agreement by the small, precise movements that served, in that room, as conclusive. The resolution was recorded. A formal Gringotts internal inquiry, Potter Trust Vault custodial registration gap, to be conducted in accordance with standard oversight protocol. The first step of the inquiry required notifying relevant employees with standing to receive internal communication. A junior administrator submitted a brief analysis of social and professional connections to the account holders' circle. Bill Weasley, cursebreaker, currently stationed in Egypt, was listed. Gringotts employee in good standing, social connection to the Weasley family, youngest Weasley brother recently enrolled at Hogwarts as a classmate of the account holder. He was identified as the appropriate internal contact for the human communication pathway. A formal notice was drafted. The clerk sealed it and marked it for Gringotts' inter-office transmission to Egypt for the attention of W. Weasley at his earliest professional convenience. The committee was adjourned. The tomb had been sealed for 300 years, which was not especially long by Egyptian standards, and the curse on the inner chamber was competent, but not creative, a variation on a binding hex layered over a standard confounding ward, with the sort of geometric precision that told you the wizard who had built it was meticulous rather than gifted. Bill Weasley worked through it in 40 minutes, stripped the outer layer clean, and sat back on his heels in the dust and the lamplight, and felt the particular professional satisfaction of a thing done correctly. He was 20 years old, and had been a Gringotts curse breaker for less than a year, and he was good at it in the way of someone who is good at most things, not without effort, not without mistake, but with the fundamental competence of a person who has grown up in a large and chaotic family and learned very early that the most useful things you can be are calm and useful. He liked Egypt. He liked the heat and the flat sky and the tombs that went down into the dark, and he liked the work, which rewarded patience and punished assumptions. He wrote home every 2 weeks. He missed his mother's cooking with a specific and durable longing that had not diminished in the months he had been here. He did not find any of this contradictory. The formal internal communication from Gringotts London arrived that afternoon through the standard inter-office channel, a sealed document with the bank's crest in the upper left, requesting his presence at Gringotts headquarters at his earliest professional convenience in connection with a custodial inquiry. The nature of the inquiry was not specified. Internal inquiries rarely were. He read it twice, noted the formal request language that meant this was not optional, and arranged for the overnight flu. He arrived in London the following morning, looking like a person who had slept in a flu network, which he had. The associate who met him at the Gringotts entrance was brisk and professional, and led him not to a customer area or a vault, but to a meeting room 2 floors below the main hall, which meant this was not routine banking business. The Goblin administrator who came in to speak with him was named, as far as Bill could render it, something in the formal register that translated roughly as the head of the Oversight Division. He sat across from Bill with the particular economy of motion of someone who considers every movement a transaction and doesn't make any of them without purpose. He explained in precise institutional language that the Potter Trust Vault had been flagged during its first primary access in July. The review had identified a gap in the vault's administrative record. No custodian had been formally registered with Gringotts at any point between 1981 and 1991. Under Gringotts' contract protocol, minor account holders required a registered custodian. There was none on file. The Oversight Committee had opened a formal internal inquiry. In the course of that inquiry, they had identified Bill Weasley as an employee with a social connection to the account holders' circle, specifically through his family's connection to a current classmate of the account holder at Hogwarts. The bank requires a human contact within the communication pathway, the administrator said. You have the clearance and the relevant standing. We are not asking for anything in violation of protocol. We are asking you to read a document. He set a sealed report on the table. Bill looked at it for a moment. The seal on the front was a departmental crest he recognized. Ministry of Magic, Department of Magical Law Enforcement, but it had been applied with a personal stamp rather than the institutional one, which was unusual. The name on the cover, in neat, level script, read, Bones, A.S., Head of Department. He picked it up and broke the seal and began to read. The report was 63 pages long and written in the plain language of official documentation, factual, precise, stripped of any phrasing that could be mistaken for interpretation. It stated at the outset that it was an inquiry into the post-war welfare and custodial status of Harry James Potter, b. 31st July, 1980, currently a minor. It stated what the investigation had found and what it had not found. The things it had not found were the center of it. No formal custodial registration, no legal guardian arrangement with the Ministry or Wizengamot, no welfare assessment conducted by any ministry department at any point between November 1981 and the date the report was filed. The most famous child in the wizarding world had been placed with Muggle relatives by the decision of a single individual, the headmaster of Hogwarts, acting without documentation, without ministry oversight, without submission of his rationale to any legal body. There was a record of Minerva McGonagall's testimony. She had observed the household chosen for the boy, had told the headmaster in plain terms that these were not suitable people, had been told it was the best available arrangement, and had made no subsequent inquiry into the boy's welfare for 9 years. The report included her exact words on both counts. It did not comment on them. It did not need to. Bill read it straight through. He read it the way he approached a complex tomb, without assumptions, following what was there, rather than what he expected. The language did not get easier as he went further in. The gap in the record was not a small gap. It was a systematic, decade-long absence of anyone checking whether a child was all right. He set the report on the table and was quiet for a moment. He thought about Ron. His youngest brother was 11 years old and sitting in a castle in Scotland right now, and had been writing home every week since September with the unfailing cheerfulness of someone who had never, in his life, had to wonder whether anyone was watching. He had grown up in a house where the question of whether someone was looking after him was not a question. It was simply the air. It had never occurred to him to question it because it had never not been true. Bill tried to imagine growing up in a house where no one was responsible for you on paper, where the official record was blank, where a person had looked at you once, in the first week of your life, and decided you were adequately arranged and had not looked again for a decade. He did not quite get there. He had not grown up in that house. He had grown up in the burrow, where the walls were not quite plumb, and the garden gnomes had to be thrown over the fence on a regular basis, and he had not known, until he read this document in a cold underground room in Gringotts, that being thrown over the fence by a parent who knew your name and would bring you back for dinner was, in the accounting of childhoods, an abundance. He looked at the Goblin administrator. What is the Gringotts position? The vault requires a registered custodian, the administrator said. This is a contract matter. The bank intends to formally notify the relevant ministry department through appropriate interinstitutional channels, requesting that the gap be remedied. We are not engaged in a human legal proceeding. We are completing a Gringotts contract record. And you want me to pass this along? We want a human employee with the appropriate standing to understand the situation and facilitate the communication pathway, the administrator said, which was a more precise version of yes. Bill could not, under the terms of his employment, share the specifics of an active Gringotts inquiry with anyone outside the bank who was not a party to the matter. This was not a small constraint. He had a father who worked in the ministry, and 7 family members who knew Harry Potter personally. There were things he very much wanted to say. He thought about what he was allowed to say. He thought about what a careful person could say within those limits that would still carry the weight of what needed carrying. He asked for a piece of parchment and a quill. An associate brought them. He sat in the anteroom with the high stone ceiling and the lamps and the distant sound of the main hall above him, and he wrote the most carefully worded letter of his life. He told his father he had come to London on Gringotts business. He said there was a matter connected to a Hogwarts student, Ron's year, that had come through the bank's official inquiry process, and that while he could not share details, he thought their father should be aware that the matter existed, and that it touched on questions of the boy's guardianship arrangement. He said their father should consider speaking to Dumbledore. He said he was sorry he couldn't say more. He read it back. He folded it. He addressed it to the Burrow and handed it to the Gringotts owl post counter on his way out. Then he walked out into Diagon Alley, where the late October morning was cold and bright, and stood for a moment in the sharp air before he turned up his collar and started walking. Arthur Weasley read his son's letter 3 times, which was not his habit. He was a man who generally read things once, with full attention, formed a view, and acted on it. The second reading was because Bill's phrasing was so careful, each sentence doing exactly what it was allowed to do, and nothing more, that Arthur wanted to be certain he had understood correctly. The third was because what he had understood was serious, and he wanted to be sure he was not projecting. He was not projecting. Bill had not broken his contract. Bill had said, there was something in Gringotts records connected to Harry Potter, a question of guardianship, and their father should speak to Dumbledore. That was all. Bill had not said what the document was or what it contained. He had said their father should speak to Dumbledore, which was the specific and deliberate phrasing of someone who has been as informative as his professional obligations permit. Arthur folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket. He was a thin, balding man with red hair and spectacles that were always slightly crooked, and he had worked in the Ministry of Magic long enough to understand that careful phrasing of this particular kind was not Bill being cautious. It was Bill saying something important through the narrow gap of what he was allowed to say. He told Molly he had an errand. He packed his coat and went to Hogwarts. The headmaster's office was at the top of a spiral staircase behind a gargoyle, and was, Arthur had heard this but had not been before, round, with portraits of former headmasters in frames around the walls, most of them doing the drowsy pantomime of pretending to sleep. There were instruments on the surfaces, silver things that spun and emitted small quantities of smoke for reasons Arthur didn't ask about. A phoenix sat on a perch near the window, large, flame-coloured, watching with the particular expression of a creature that has seen everything long enough to have stopped being surprised by any of it. Dumbledore rose from behind his desk to greet him, and the room contracted slightly around his presence, in the way of rooms occupied by people who have been the largest figure in them for a very long time. He was, and Arthur was not given to overstatement, one of the most impressive men Arthur had ever been in a room with. Very long silver hair and a beard to match, half-moon spectacles, a crooked nose, and the bright blue eyes of someone whose attentiveness was habitual and total. He received Arthur with warmth that was entirely genuine, and a consideration that Arthur recognized, with the experience of many years working near the powerful, as the consideration of a man who already knew, with reasonable accuracy, why Arthur was here. Arthur sat down. He explained Bill's letter without naming Bill. He was not going to create a problem for his son, said only that he had received information through a contact at Gringotts, indicating that there was an open inquiry into the Potter Trust Vault's custodial record. He asked the headmaster whether he could explain the nature of the custodial arrangement that had been made for Harry Potter in November 1981. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Then he explained it. Lily Potter's sacrificial magic, sealed by her act of dying for her child, the protection that act had created, not a spell, not a ward, but something older and harder to name, was tied to blood, specifically to Petunia Dursley as Lily's surviving sister. If Petunia took Harry in and raised him as family, the protection would persist. A child anchored to that blood connection, in that house, was safer from Voldemort than a child anywhere else the wizarding world could offer. He had made the judgment that no other available arrangement could provide that specific, documented form of protection. He had placed Harry there in November 1981. He believed then, and still, believed that the decision had kept Harry alive. Arthur listened to all of this. He had heard Lily Potter's sacrificial magic discussed before. It was not a secret. It was the story every witch and wizard told about how Voldemort had been defeated, and he had told it to his own children. He understood the logic of it. He had always assumed that Dumbledore had followed appropriate procedure alongside the magical reasoning. "Did you submit the custodial arrangement to the Wizengamot?" he asked. "Or to any legal body?" "No," Dumbledore said. He said it calmly, in the same tone. "Was there a welfare assessment? Any ministry notification?" "No." Arthur sat with that for a moment. He was not a person given to confrontation, but he had spent 20 years in a ministry department where the gap between what was legal and what was documented was a gap that people fell into, and he knew what that gap looked like from the inside. The magic had been real. Arthur had no reason to doubt that. But the magic being real and the arrangement being legal were two different propositions, and the ministry's relevant department had apparently never been invited to evaluate either of them. "He's been at Privet Drive for 10 years, Arthur said, and no one checked. "He is here now," Dumbledore said, and there was, not defensiveness in it, but something deliberate, a weight placed on the present tense. "He is at Hogwarts. His welfare here is my personal priority. I would ask you to allow the institutional processes to proceed in their proper channel, Arthur, and to trust that Harry is watched and known and safe in this building." He said this with complete and practiced composure and without apology, and Arthur recognized, with the rueful clarity of a person who has had this precise experience with powerful men before, that he had received the maximum Dumbledore was prepared to give, and that pressing for more would produce the same substance delivered with additional warmth, but no additional content. He was not going to get a different answer today. He thanked Dumbledore for his time. Dumbledore thanked him for coming. The Phoenix watched from its perch and did not weigh in. 3 days later, in the dungeons below Hogwarts, Severus Snape looked at Harry Potter for the first time across a cauldron bench and felt something he had not expected to feel. Surprise. He had known in the abstract that this would happen, that sooner or later he would look up in a potions lesson and see James Potter's son in the front rows with his insufferable hair. He had prepared for it with the specific preparedness of someone who has had a decade to decide what they will feel when a thing they have been dreading arrives. He was prepared to feel contempt, justified and immediate. He was prepared to see James Potter's face with Lily's eyes in it, which was a particular cruelty that the world had apparently decided Severus Snape deserved. He was not prepared for the way the boy sat. Harry Potter, age 11, sat in the potions dungeon with his elbows in. He did not sprawl or lean or take up space beyond the space he was allocated. He watched Snape with Lily's green eyes. There they were, exactly as wretched as anticipated. And the watching was careful and contained, without the bluster or the easy confidence that Snape had spent 10 years rehearsing his response to. James Potter had entered every room at this school as though he were the event. His son entered this room like someone who had learned, early and completely, that occupying space was a thing that required justification. Snape asked the boy about bezoars. This was standard. He asked every first-year class about bezoars on the first day, which they had not yet studied, which was the point. Harry Potter did not know about bezoars. He said so directly, and without the flinch Snape expected. He met the question, and the person asking it, with the flat steadiness of someone who has had a great deal of experience with people who intend to be unfair, and has accordingly stopped being startled by it. Snape wrote him off publicly, as he always wrote off Potters, because publicly that was what he intended to do, and he continued the lesson. But he noted it. He held it at a small distance from the contempt that was professionally required of him, and turned it once, the way you turn a fact that does not fit the theory before setting it aside to be held there, separately, without conclusion, against whatever he might understand later. The boy was not James. That was the extent of what Snape was prepared to conclude. It was more than he had expected to conclude, and he did not examine why. 6 weeks was long enough to be certain. She had not rushed to a conclusion. That was not how she worked, and in more than 3 decades of teaching, she had developed a healthy respect for the ways in which a first impression of a child could mislead. Children arrived at Hogwarts, carrying the residue of their summer, in ways that faded with September and October. The shyness of the genuinely shy resolving into confidence once the environment became familiar, the bravado of the anxious eventually settling into something quieter. She knew how to wait. She had waited, and 6 weeks had not changed what she was seeing. Harry Potter's robes were second-hand and too large at the shoulder. He had not come into money gradually, with a Diagon Alley visit and a pile of new things. He had arrived with the particular look of a child for whom new things were not the standard. She had watched him eat at the Gryffindor table with the focused attention of someone for whom a full plate was not an assumption. She had watched him sit in her own classroom with his elbows drawn in and his answers given carefully, without the sprawling ease of a child who had never been made to feel that taking up space required justification. She had watched him, twice now, flinch, just slightly, the way of someone with a well-trained startle, when voices carried sharply in the corridor. There was something else, smaller, harder to name. On the third week, she had handed back essays and called his name, and he had looked up with an expression that was ready to be corrected, braced for it, before he had even seen what mark she had given him. She had not given him a poor mark. He had looked at the grade, and then at her, and then back at the grade, with the brief and visible confusion of someone receiving something they had not learned to expect. She had looked away. She had thought about it for the rest of the lesson. She had taught Percy Weasley, and Fred and George Weasley, and before them Bill and Charlie, and she knew, with the specific professional literacy of someone who has taught children across 30 years, what a well-tended child looked like. It looked like Ron Weasley, who sat next to Harry at every lesson with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up loved, and knew it, even in the years when the jumper was too small and the textbooks were already written in. It did not look like what she was seeing. She had told herself, in September, that she was watching too closely, that she was looking for something because of the deposition she had given to Amelia Bones in January, because she had come back from Hogwarts to the ministry and written the word no and put it in a report, and it had gone into a folder she had tried not to think about since. She had told herself she was projecting. By October, she had stopped telling herself that. She did not make an appointment. She came to Dumbledore's office on a Tuesday evening in early November, after the students were in their dormitories, and she climbed the spiral staircase and knocked once and opened the door without waiting for an answer, which was her prerogative as deputy headmistress, and which she had rarely used in precisely this way. Dumbledore was at his desk. The portraits were doing their habitual pretense of sleeping. The phoenix was on its perch, and it looked at her when she came in with the particular directness of creatures that cannot be lied to and do not pretend otherwise. She closed the door behind her. She sat in the chair across from Dumbledore's desk without being invited, which was also her prerogative, and she told him what she had been seeing. She did it the way she gave the deposition to Amelia Bones. Facts, sequence, no commentary beyond what the facts required. She described what she had observed in 6 weeks of watching his first-year Gryffindors. She named the specific things she had noted: the robes, the eating, the flinch, with the flat precision of someone who has been a professional long enough to know that observation does not need embellishment to carry weight. Dumbledore was still throughout. He did not interrupt. He received what she was telling him with the particular attention of a man who already knows the direction a river is running and is watching it run. When she had finished, she said, "I gave a formal deposition to Amelia Bones in January, about the night of the 2nd of November, 1981. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. She was 56 years old, and she had known Albus Dumbledore for longer than Harry Potter had been alive, and she knew what it cost him to say those 2 words in that tone. It was not much, but it was not nothing. She had come here intending to tell him what she had been seeing. She had told him. She had intended, after that, to ask him what he was going to do about it. But sitting across the desk from him now, in the lamplight, with the portraits pretending to sleep around the walls, she understood that the question she needed to answer was not addressed to him. "I knew," she said. She did not make it an accusation. She made it what it was, a fact. "I was there. I argued, I was overruled, and then I did nothing. For 10 years, Albus. His name appeared on the Hogwarts intake list every September. I saw it every September. I didn't visit him. I didn't write. I accepted your decision because fighting it a second time seemed impossible, and because—" She stopped. she restarted with the precision of someone who has given this sufficient thought to be exact. Because it was easier not to know whether I had been right. Because if I had been right, then what I did next, which was nothing, meant something I did not want it to mean. And so I chose, every September, not to look. The fire gave a small sound in the grate. Outside, the November grounds lay dark. "I am not here to ask you to justify yourself," she said. "I know your justification. I heard it in 1981. The blood protection. Lily's sacrifice. Petunia's house. I know the logic, and I know it was sound." She looked at him steadily. "The magic was real, but we didn't check on him, Albus. Not once. Not in 10 years. A welfare visit. A letter. Someone's eyes on the boy. We did none of it." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. The bright blue eyes were not evasive. That had never been Dumbledore's way. He met what she was saying directly, and considered it without the deflection that lesser people would have reached for. "The protection was the primary concern," he said. I still believe, that the blood magic anchored to Petunia's home was the single most effective safeguard available to him. If Voldemort had returned while Harry was a child, that ward was the difference between his survival and his death. I arranged the placement to ensure the ward held. I believed that was sufficient. "You told me it was the best place for him," she said. "Yes. That is not the same argument." He held her gaze. "No," he said, after a moment. "It is not." And there it was. The small space. The admission he could not close. Not a collapse. Not an apology, in any form she could have named. Just the acknowledgement, held between them in the particular way of two people who have been honest with each other across a long professional life, that a true rationale and a sufficient one were not the same thing, and that he had not always been careful about the distinction. She had the sense, watching him, of a man who had begun, quietly, without ceremony, to reckon with something he had been avoiding reckoning with, and who was finding it heavier than anticipated. "I have made errors in my decisions about Harry," he said. "I have come to understand that more clearly than I did." He said it in the plain, even tone of someone who is not asking for absolution and is not offering explanation, just setting down a fact alongside the others. "What I cannot give you is the 10 years back." "I am not asking for them," she said. "What I am telling you is that I intend to watch him now, while he is under this roof. I intend to make certain someone is paying attention." Dumbledore looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Good." She stood. She was not, she thought, going home to sleep easily. She was not going to forgive herself tonight for the Septembers. But she knew now exactly what she was going to do, and knowing that was something distinct from forgiveness, smaller and more useful, and available right now. She left. The door closed behind her. In the corridor the torches were low, and the castle was quiet, with the particular quiet of a building full of sleeping children, a sound she had lived inside for 30 years, and never quite stopped hearing as its own distinct thing. She walked back down the spiral staircase and through the corridor, and did not hurry. In the grate behind her the fire settled, and the portraits went on sleeping, or pretending to, and the phoenix watched the door for a moment after she had gone, then turned its head away. The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, stamped with the Gringotts institutional seal, and addressed to the Minister for Magic in the formal, unhurried register of an organization that had never in its history felt the need to be urgent. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was a courtesy preamble. The second paragraph stated that the Gringotts Wizarding Bank Oversight Committee had, in the course of its standard review procedures, opened a formal internal inquiry into the custodial record of the Potter Trust Vault, and that the Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement had been identified as the relevant ministry body for inter-institutional notification purposes. The third paragraph stated that the inquiry was proceeding in accordance with Gringotts' institutional protocol, and that no action by the ministry was requested at this time. Cornelius Fudge read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk very carefully, the way a man sets down something that has turned out to be hotter than he expected, and he was still for a long moment. Not the stillness of thought, but the stillness of a person who has understood in a single clear and unwelcome flash that something he believed he had managed is no longer being managed. He was a careful man. He had spent his career being careful, had built the first peaceful decade of the post-war wizarding world by being the calm, reliable, administrative face of stability. And he understood, better than most people gave him credit for, that stability was not a natural state. It required maintenance. It required the steady management of inconvenient truths. The Potter matter had been an inconvenient truth. He had managed it. He had reclassified the report. He had spoken to Amelia Bones with the particular warm authority of a man who had handled these situations before, and he had assumed, correctly on the evidence, that the matter was contained. He had not, apparently, fully mapped the boundary of what he could contain. He called his senior staff. He asked for a full accounting of what had been received at Gringotts through ministry communication channels in the preceding 8 months. The accounting took 2 hours. What it produced, at the end of those 2 hours, was a record of a single inter-institutional banking correspondence transmitted the previous spring, carrying the personal departmental seal of the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He looked at the seal, Amelia Bones, DMLE head, her own crest rather than the ministry's institutional mark, and felt the particular quality of anger that belongs to a person who has been outmaneuvered by someone who stayed, throughout, entirely within the rules. He sent for her. She arrived at his office 20 minutes later and sat down across from him with the composed, broad-shouldered stillness of someone who had known this meeting was coming and had been entirely undisturbed by the prospect. She was wearing her monocle. She folded her hands in her lap. She waited. He told her she had transmitted a ministry document through a non-ministry communication channel without ministerial authorization. He said it with the measured warmth of a man who considers himself reasonable, who is explaining a clear procedural error to a colleague who had perhaps not fully considered the implications. "I transmitted my own sealed report," Amelia said, "bearing my personal departmental seal." And here she paused, fractionally, to distinguish it from the ministry's institutional seal, which she hadn't used and wouldn't have used without authorization, through the interinstitutional banking correspondence channel, which is a legitimate communication mechanism available to the head of the DMLE for official contact with financial institutions operating in Wizarding Britain. She held his gaze. "I have used it before. It is within my authority. I did not break any ministry rule, Minister." He told her the matter had been classified as headmaster's discretion and was therefore no longer within the DMLE's operational remit. "At the time I transmitted the report," she said, "I was aware of that classification. My report bore my personal seal, not the ministry's. It was transmitted in my capacity as DMLE head within my professional discretion. The classification of the ministry's copy does not retroactively govern what I transmit using my own authority." He looked at her. He had the lime green bowler hat off his head. He had taken it off when she came in, perhaps because the meeting required him to seem reasonable, and it was sitting on the desk between them, like a small, futile flag. He told her to retract it. He said Gringotts should be contacted and asked to return the document. Amelia looked at him with the patient, entirely non-hostile expression of someone explaining something factual to someone who would prefer the facts were different. "Gringotts does not return correspondence," she said. "It is not within their institutional practice to do so, and it is not within our authority to compel them to. The sealed copy is now a matter of Gringotts' institutional record. The Ministry of Magic cannot issue orders to Gringotts regarding the contents of their own archive. That is not," and here she paused again, "not for effect but for precision, a matter of policy. It is a matter of the legal framework governing Gringotts' independence from the Ministry, which predates my employment and yours and has not changed." There was a silence. Through the window, the enchanted ceiling of the Ministry atrium was visible below, the familiar artificial blue, and Fudge looked at it for a moment, as though it might offer something the conversation had not. He told her that her conduct at the DMLE had been a matter of concern. He told her this with the specific gravity of a man moving to his remaining tool. She said, without raising her voice, "I would welcome a formal Wizengamot review of my conduct. If you would like to initiate one, I will cooperate fully with any investigation." He did not have a legal basis for a Wizengamot review. She knew it. He knew it. The hat sat on the desk. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was not threatening. It was the silence of an argument that has reached its natural conclusion without producing a winner, and both parties know it. Fudge said, finally, that he trusted she understood the sensitivity of the matter, and that he was relying on her discretion going forward. Amelia said that of course she understood the sensitivity of the matter, and that her professional discretion was, as always, impeccable. She thanked him for his time. She stood, she nodded, and she left. He sat for a moment after the door closed. Then he picked up his hat, looked at it, and set it back down. He was less certain of things than he had been in spring, and he was a man who relied on certainty, had built his entire professional identity on the calm projection of it. The tools he had used for 15 years of ministry work were exactly as sharp as they had always been. The problem was the institution he was trying to apply them to. He could reclassify a ministry document. He could pressure a ministry employee. He could manage the daily profit. He could not issue orders to Gringotts Wizarding Bank, and Gringotts Wizarding Bank had, now, a copy of the document, and an open inquiry, and the institutional permanence of an organization that had been operating since the Middle Ages, and had outlasted every government that had ever tried to compel it to do something it had decided not to do. He reached for the writing paper on his desk and wrote a brief note to a contact he had maintained at the Daily Prophet for 11 years, a senior editor who understood, without being told explicitly, what was required. He suggested, in the pleasant and indirect language that both of them understood, that the DMLE under its current head had been developing a pattern of overreach, that certain departmental decisions of the past year had raised questions among senior ministry officials about professional boundaries, and that this might be a line worth exploring in the coming weeks. He folded it. He sealed it. He sent it by Ministry Owl. He sat back in his chair and looked at the enchanted ceiling below and thought, not for the first time, about how much easier everything would have been if Amelia Bones had simply been the kind of person who could be managed. Hagrid had known something was happening since the week after Arthur Weasley's visit. You could not keep a thing entirely quiet in a school this size, not among the staff, who talked to each other in the evenings in the way of people who shared a building and a purpose, and not quite enough of either to fill all the available hours. He had not been told directly. He was the gamekeeper, not a professor, and certain conversations stopped when he came in from the grounds. but he had been at Hogwarts since he was 13 years old and had learned its particular silences and what they contained. And what this silence contained was the name Harry Potter in the mouths of people who had previously treated the matter of Harry Potter's past as a thing that was simply and permanently settled. He had been carrying things since the beginning of September, since the night on the motorbike, if he was honest. He had been carrying things since that night in November, 10 years ago. Though some weights you carry for so long, you stop naming them and start calling them just the way things are. He had loved Harry Potter from the first moment, had held him, a year old and asleep, and entirely unbothered by the cold in the ruins of a house in Godric's Hollow, and had wept against the small weight of him all the way through the dark on Sirius's motorbike. He had done what he was asked to do. He had not been asked whether he thought it was the right thing. That was not the kind of question that was put to Hagrid. He was the instrument, and the decision was Dumbledore's, and he had understood, because he trusted Dumbledore, and because the explanation made magical sense, that this was how it had to be. He had understood it all the way up until July, when Harry had stood in Vault 687, with his mouth slightly open, and looked at the gold that had been waiting for him for 10 years, and the look on his face had not been the look of a boy who had found treasure. It was the look of a boy who had just understood, for the first time, the size of what had been kept from him. That was the thing Hagrid had been carrying since July, the knowledge that nobody had told Harry anything about his own life. He sent an invitation to Gryffindor Tower on a Wednesday in late November. Would Harry like to come for tea? He would have made more food, but he always made rock cakes for Harry, which Harry always ate out of politeness rather than genuine hunger. That was all right. The point was not the food. Harry came down to the hut in the late afternoon with his scarf on slightly crooked and his robes pushed up at the sleeves. He was small for 11, and his hair was doing its habitual untidy thing, and he came in through the door with the ease of someone who had already decided this was a safe place and sat down at the table without being told to. Fang shoved his enormous head into Harry's lap immediately, which was Fang's standard behavior and required no comment. Harry scratched his ears. The fire was going. Hagrid poured the tea in his own mug, and the slightly smaller oversized mug he kept for Harry, and set the rock cakes between them, and sat across the table and tried to find where to begin. The problem was that there was no good beginning. There was a true beginning, which was a night in 1981 in a ruined house, and there was the beginning of what he actually knew, which was that when Dumbledore decided where Harry would live, not everyone had agreed with him. Hagrid started there. He said it clumsily. He said it in the way he said most things, directly, without much shape to it, his enormous hands around his mug and his beetle-black eyes on Harry's face, which was still and careful and watching in the particular way Harry had of receiving information. He said that on the night Professor Dumbledore brought Harry to Privet Drive, there had been someone else there who did not think it was the right place. Someone who had watched the Dursleys all day and told Dumbledore plainly what she thought of them, and told him plainly that Harry Potter ought not to be sent there. Harry was quiet. He did not say anything. He waited. That was Professor McGonagall, Hagrid said. She watched those people from before it was even light. She told Dumbledore they were the worst sort of muggles imaginable. She argued for you. He looked at his tea. Dumbledore made the decision himself, and she was overruled, and I carried you there, and that was that. Harry still did not speak. He was holding his mug in both hands and looking at Hagrid with Lily's green eyes, which had always been the part of this that was hardest for Hagrid to look at directly. I'm the one who brought you there, Hagrid said. I collected you from where your mum and dad were, that night. Dumbledore asked me to, and I did. And I've never—" He stopped. He took a breath. "I've never been sure it was the right thing. And I don't know what I should have done. I wasn't the one who decided. But I was the one who carried you, and I've been sorry about it ever since I knew what sorry meant." The fire settled. Fang had stopped moving and had simply put his entire weight against Harry's legs in the comfortable way of a dog that has decided to be permanently attached. Outside, the November dark was full on. Harry looked at Hagrid for a long moment. There was something working in his expression. Not grief, not anger. Something more complicated and more private than either of those things. He had the face of a child who has spent 11 years learning to process information quietly, alone, without the assumption that expressing what you feel will produce anything useful. He was doing that now, processing, not performing anything, just thinking. "Did anyone argue for me?" he said. It came out flat, not quite a question. "McGonagall did," Hagrid said. "She said it straight out. He didn't listen." The fire shifted again. Somewhere on the grounds, an owl called. Harry looked at his hands around the mug and was quiet for another long moment. "Okay," he said finally. "Thank you for telling me." He said it the way a much older person would say it. Simply, without drama, meaning it. He stayed for another half hour. He ate one rock cake all the way through, which he did not usually manage. He talked about Ron and about the potions lessons, and about the fact that Hermione had just beaten him at every category of a quiz in charms, and he was considering whether to be impressed or competitive. And they sat by the fire until the evening was fully dark, and then Harry put his coat back on and said good night to Fang, and went. Hagrid sat for a while after he was gone and looked at the fire. He did not feel better, exactly. He felt the particular uncomfortable lightness of a thing finally set down, still saw where the weight had been, still uncertain it had been the right thing to say, but no longer carrying it alone. Harry walked back across the grounds by himself in the dark. The castle was lit above him, the windows warm in the November cold, and he walked with his hands in his coat pockets and thought about the thing Hagrid had told him. He had known, in the abstract, that he had come from somewhere, that people had made decisions about where he would go. He had not known that those decisions had been contested. He had not known that anyone had looked at the place they were sending him and said, out loud, to the person sending him, "No, not there." He had not known that someone had argued for him. He was 11 years old, and he did not have the language for what he was carrying back across the dark grounds. But it was not what he had carried on the way out. On the way out, he had carried the same weight he always carried, the familiar, shapeless thing of not knowing and not being told. On the way back, he was carrying something smaller and harder, a fact, specific and solid, not enough to fix anything, not enough to give him back the 10 years, not enough to change what the Dursleys were, or make the cupboard under the stairs into something other than what it had been. Just the knowledge that on one November night in 1981, one person had looked at where they were sending him and said, "No," and that was not enough. And it was also, somehow, against all reasonable expectation, something. He went inside. The doors closed behind him, and the fire in the entrance hall was warm, and he climbed the stairs toward Gryffindor Tower, and the sound of Ron arguing cheerfully with someone about something that did not matter in the least, and held on to what he had. The communication arrived on a Thursday morning in late November, delivered through the inter-institutional banking channel in the same formal register in which all Gringotts correspondence arrived, precise, impersonal, unhurried. It was addressed to the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement in her official capacity. It requested a meeting at Gringotts headquarters at her earliest professional convenience. It stated the purpose as the Potter Trust Vault Custodial Inquiry. It gave a proposed date. Amelia read it twice, made a note in her diary, and sent back a confirmation. She told no one in the ministry, except her own administrative clerk, as required by standard procedure, who noted it in the departmental calendar under the anodyne heading Interinstitutional Banking. She told the clerk to file it and say nothing further. She went back to work. Gringotts in early December was cold, the way only underground things are cold. Not the outdoor cold of weather, but the deeper, settled cold of stone that had been the same temperature for centuries and had no particular interest in changing. She was met at the entrance by an associate who led her below the main hall, past the vault levels, to a meeting room that was clearly not designed for human guests. The table was long and low, the chairs behind it sized for the committee that would occupy them, and the single chair on Amelia's side of the table had been raised on a small platform with the matter-of-fact improvisation of an institution that accommodates human visitors when it must, and sees no reason to pretend the accommodation is natural. She sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. The Senior Oversight Committee filed in. There were 5 of them, dressed in the dark, formal wear of Gringotts' institutional business, and they took their places behind the table with the efficient, unsentimental movement of people for whom this meeting was one item in a full day of institutional work. The chairperson, the senior member, seated at the center of the 5, had the sharp eyes and careful economy of bearing of someone who had overseen a great many inquiries and found all of them equivalent in their basic structure. He looked at Amelia across the table with neither friendliness nor hostility, and she looked back with the same. He opened the meeting by stating the inquiry reference number and the date and the names of those present. Then he set out the 3 items. The first item was a sealed report received by Gringotts through the Interinstitutional Banking Correspondence Channel in the spring of 1991, transmitted by the head of the DMLE and bearing her personal departmental seal. The report concerned the welfare and custodial status of Harry James Potter, a minor, current holder of the Potter Trust Vault. The report had been received, logged, archived, and reviewed by the Oversight Committee in the course of their standard procedures following the Vault's first primary access in July 1991. He set the report on the table between them. It was Amelia's own document. She recognized her own seal, and seeing it there, in a Gringotts meeting room, was the first moment in the entire 18 months of this process that she felt something that was almost, but not quite, relief. It was still there. It had not been lost, or misfiled, or quietly removed. Gringotts had received it and kept it, and it was now on the table in front of an oversight committee, which was exactly what she had sent it there to be. The second item was the Potter Trust Vault Access Record. The chairperson set another document alongside the first. No custodial registration had been filed with Gringotts at any point between the Vault's establishment in November 1981 and the primary access in July 1991. No custodial management instructions had been received. No correspondence concerning the account had been received from any registered guardian. The vault had stood undisturbed for 10 years, under the account name of a minor, with no formally registered custodian in the Gringotts record. The third item was the relevant clause of Gringotts Contract Protocol. Minor account holders required a registered custodian on file. The custodian was responsible for the account until the holder reached majority. Without a registered custodian, the contract was incomplete. This was not, the chairperson stated, a matter of human law or ministry regulation. It was a matter of Gringotts's own institutional record and its own contractual standards, which were Gringotts's to enforce according to Gringotts's procedures. The committee's finding was stated in a single sentence. The Potter Trust Vault had operated for 10 years without a registered custodian, in breach of Gringotts' contract protocol. Then the chairperson stopped. He had laid out 3 items and stated a finding. He had not editorialized. He had not expressed outrage or sympathy or any other emotional category. He had presented institutional facts in the language of an institution, which was the only language that would make these facts permanent. Amelia let the silence sit for a moment. Then she asked, in a voice that was equally level, what remedy the goblins were seeking. The chairperson consulted briefly with the committee member to his left, a low, rapid exchange that she could not follow, and then looked back at her. The vault required a registered custodian. The account holder had accessed the vault and would continue to do so. The contract gap required remedy. The committee recommended that the ministry's relevant body, the DMLE, formally register a custodial arrangement for the account holder's vault, as should have been done in November 1981. The goblins do not specify who that custodian should be, he said. That is not a Gringotts matter. It is a ministry and a legal matter. We specify that the registration must be completed, and that it must be completed in accordance with proper procedure, and that it must be recorded in both the Gringotts Institutional Archive and the Ministry's custodial record. He paused. We are notifying you in your official capacity that this finding exists and is now permanently part of our archive. It cannot be removed. It cannot be revised. It is a matter of Gringotts' record. The last 4 words landed in the room with the specific finality of a vault door closing. Amelia understood what this meant. The report was no longer a single buried ministry document, reclassified and filed away in a folder Fudge could quietly keep closed. It was now an item of record in 2 institutions. Fudge could not reclassify a Gringotts notification. He could not file it under headmaster's discretion. There was now a finding in Gringotts's own archive, delivered to the DMLE in writing, stating plainly that Harry Potter had spent 10 years with no registered guardian on file, and that this required formal action. She thanked the committee for the meeting. The committee chairperson acknowledged her thanks in the tone of an institution that does not require them. The members rose. The meeting was adjourned. She picked up her case and walked back through the stone corridor toward the stairs that led to the surface. The corridor was narrow and lit by wall-mounted lamps that threw a flat, even light, and it smelled of the deep, cold mineral smell of the vault levels, and it was entirely quiet. Bill Weasley was waiting in the anteroom at the top of the first staircase. He was leaning against the wall with his hands in his coat pockets, and he straightened when she came through the door. She recognized him from the file. Gringotts' employee, the committee's chosen human contact. And from his expression, she understood he recognized her too. Not her face, perhaps, but what she represented in this particular hallway on this particular morning. Nothing was said. He looked at her with the direct, level look of someone who has read the same document she sent and knows now what it cost her to write it, and more than that, to send it to the one place in Britain that could not give it back. She looked back with the equally direct look of someone not surprised to find him standing exactly here. He nodded. She nodded. She walked past him and up the next staircase and through the main hall and out through the front doors of Gringotts into Diagon Alley, where the December morning was cold and grey and entirely ordinary. The cobblestones were damp. The shops were open. People moved past in their winter robes and paid no particular attention to the broad, square-jawed woman standing for a moment on the steps. Somewhere above and to the left, through the underground tunnels, and into another part of the city entirely, the Ministry of Magic was where it always was. Fudge was in it. The Daily Prophet was running its careful murmur about DMLE overreach, because that was the remaining tool, and he was using it. The sealed report was now in 2 places he could not reach. She turned up her collar and started walking. The article appeared on page 7 of the Daily Prophet on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of December, 4 column inches beneath a piece about Quidditch transfer season, and above an advertisement for Madame Malkin's winter robes. It was not a front-page story. It did not name Harry Potter. It referred throughout to a prominent minor account holder and a custodial registration gap identified in Gringotts' institutional records, and it cited, without elaborating, a formal notification received by the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement from Gringotts Wizarding Bank. It was headlined, Ministry Welfare Records Under Scrutiny in Gringotts Inquiry, in the modest type reserved for stories that are inconvenient but not yet openly embarrassing. The journalist who had written it was not someone Fudge had cultivated, which was the point. Most of the Prophet's senior staff knew the shape of what the ministry preferred. This journalist had written it from the Gringotts notification, which was a formal interinstitutional document and therefore technically part of the public record, and which Fudge had not generated and could not suppress, and had no one but himself to blame for not having anticipated. The story was modest. The story was accurate. The story was there. Fudge read it at his desk with a cup of tea that went cold while he was reading. When he had finished, he was still for a moment. Then he picked up his lime-green bowler hat. It had been on the stand by the window since he came in. He had not put it on yet, which he sometimes didn't, first thing, and he held it in both hands and looked at it and set it back down. His tools worked best before the story existed. He could bury a ministry document. He could not unfile a Gringotts record. He could manage Amelia Bones when he was the one explaining her own report back to her. He could not remove her, and she had survived every tool he had applied. He could run the campaign against her in the Prophet, had been running it. But she was still in post, still correct, and the story was on page 7, where he had not put it and could not take it back. He stared at the article for a long time. Then he did what there was to do, which was nothing, and went back to work. Dumbledore read the same article at his desk in the Hogwarts headmaster's office later that morning, while the fire burned and the portraits continued their comfortable pretense of sleep. Gringotts had formally notified the DMLE. That was the article's basis. Arthur Weasley had come to him in October with a question about Harry's guardianship and a reference to something at Gringotts, and Dumbledore had explained himself and believed the matter would proceed through channels he could follow. He had not known about the sealed copy. He had not known who had opened the channel. He was beginning to understand. He sent a message to Professor McGonagall. She came in the early afternoon, during the hour between her last lesson and the start of evening duties, and sat in the chair across his desk with the composed, square-shouldered bearing she always carried, and which had, in the weeks since November, seemed to him to carry something additional. Not a burden, exactly, but the particular quality of someone who has named a thing and is now living with having named it. He showed her the article. She read it. He said, without preface, "The question you raised has found its way to light through a channel I did not anticipate." He paused. "I should like to know what you think should be done now." McGonagall looked at him. She had known Albus Dumbledore for decades, had worked for him for most of her professional life, and there were certain things that were and were not in his register. Asking her what she thought was not, historically, in his register. He had asked it now in the tone of someone who has come to understand that a habit of deciding alone has costs, and who is, imperfectly, and too late, and without making a formal announcement of the fact, attempting to address that. "I am going to start checking on him," she said. "While he is here, under this roof, I am going to make sure that someone is watching." She said it plainly, as she said most things, not as a policy position and not as a report, as a statement of what she was going to do. I know what a child who has not been watched looks like. I have spent 30 years learning to recognize it. I was the person who said, in 1981, that this was wrong. I did not say it again for 10 years, which is something I will not be able to undo. But he is here now, and I am here, and I am going to watch him. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Good." Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else, exactly, to say. Nothing that would add to what had been said, rather than simply taking up the room it occupied. McGonagall stood, nodded, and left. Dumbledore sat for a while longer with the article on the desk. Through the window, the December sky was the flat grey of very cold air, and the grounds were bare, and somewhere in the castle the students were having their lunch. Harry Potter stayed at Hogwarts for Christmas. Going back to Privet Drive had not been presented as a requirement, and Ron was staying, and the decision required very little deliberation. He sent the Dursleys a brief note because it seemed the correct form to observe. He did not receive a reply. The castle at Christmas was quieter and warmer than term time, full of a domestic ease that happened when a building stopped being required to be official. The decorations went up, the enchanted snow didn't get you wet, and the students who had stayed settled into the rhythms of a small family in a large house. On Christmas Day, the great hall was set for the handful who remained. The enchanted ceiling showed a clear winter sky, bright and cold above the floating candles, and the tables had been brought together into one and laden with everything: goose and potatoes and roasted vegetables and crackers that went off with small dignified bangs and produced hats in colours that had no business being dignified and were, somewhat, anyway. Harry sat between Ron and Neville and across from Hermione and ate Christmas dinner in the warmth of a place that was, at least for now, more home than anywhere he had been. He did not know about the Daily Prophet article. He did not know about the Gringotts hearing in early December, or about Amelia Bones, or about the sealed report that had spent 9 months in an archive before it was laid on a stone table, and its contents became a matter of permanent institutional record. He knew none of the institutional machinery that had been turning, for a year and a half, in the background of his life. He knew one thing that was personal, that on a night in November 1981, someone had looked at where they were sending him and had said no, and had been overruled, and that her name was McGonagall. He did not feel watched in the anxious way he had felt watched at the Dursleys, where being noticed meant something was about to go wrong. He felt, just slightly, looked after. It was a different sensation, and he did not fully have a name for it yet. But it was there, warmly and specifically there, in the way of a thing that had been absent for 11 years and was beginning to arrive. Across the hall, at the staff table, Professor McGonagall sat with her tea and watched the first years at their Christmas dinner. She was 56 years old. She had been a teacher for longer than most of them had been alive, and she had sat at this table for more Christmases than she could readily count, and she had watched a great many students eat a great many Christmas dinners, and she had not always been watching in the way she was watching now, with intent, with the specific weight of a person who has decided that watching is the thing she owes. She watched Harry Potter eat his Christmas dinner. She watched him laugh at something Ron said. She watched him pull a cracker with Neville and put on the paper hat with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who finds, to his own slight surprise, that he is comfortable. She watched him look up at the enchanted ceiling with the candles floating and the clear winter sky beyond them, and she watched his face in the moment he looked at it, which was the face of a child who has not yet finished being astonished that this is where he lives. That was the whole of it. Not justice, nothing in the story reversed, nothing given back. Not vindication, nothing proved that required proving. Just an 11-year-old boy eating Christmas dinner in the great hall of Hogwarts, and across the room a woman watching him, not with grief, not with guilt,